Today's presenter is Corey Ponder. Corey is an empathy practitioner and educator who works with innovative companies and individuals to build empathetic spaces for inclusive and diverse experiences. Corey believes in the power of human connection and how that drives real impact. Over his 11 years of professional experience as a policy analyst in the public sector and a program manager and policy professional in the private sector, Corey knows that an emphasis on emotional intelligence, self-awareness, empathy, and interpersonal skills leads to a more committed, productive, and engaged workforce, creating a real impact in the workplace and the spaces they occupy. Corey has scaled diversity initiatives across several companies, including with the CIA and Facebook, and has spoken on allyship and empathy for several organizations, including Google, Fitbit, Expedia, Innovators Box, and General Assembly. He has also developed and facilitated many workshops on empathy, allyship, bias, privilege, and race. He continues to publish on these topics as well, being featured in Fortune Magazine's Race Ahead newsletter, Women 2.0, Change Catalyst Leading with Empathy series. Corey holds a master's degree in public policy from the University of California, Berkeley, and a bachelor's in political science from Vanderbilt University. I'm so excited to have Corey with us today, and now I'm going to turn it over to Corey.
Thank you so much, Rihanna, for the introduction. And also thank you to the Alumni Association for having me. Always enjoy the opportunity to re-engage with alums and the Vanderbilt community, and especially when I get to explore topics that I am deeply passionate about, in this case, empathy. Now, today, specifically, I want to dive in on empathy and how it's connected to leadership and how it actually is a function of our leadership styles and inclusivity. And hopefully by the end of this conversation, it will inspire a bit of the same passion in you. So I want to thank all of you for being present on the call, and I will leave time at the end for questions, as Rihanna said. And again, really looking forward to engaging with you. So Rihanna talked a little bit about my background, but I remember this leadership conversation from Simon Sinek, who said, people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And so I think in the context of today and trying to understand why I show up to this conversation, I thought I would actually tell you my why. And that really is that I'm passionate about building community and helping others develop and progress along their journey. And so in my time, in different roles and in different experiences that I've had, I've practiced empathy, and I've really tried to spread the gospel of it for its value in building healthy teams and also building inclusion. And the ways that I have been able to engage with empathy and engage with this work is through relationship building in various roles, through doing this work as an educator, through advocacy, and ultimately in just learning how to show up more for others. Now, I want to start with a question. When was the last time that you on this call consciously thought about empathy? Whether that was in a professional setting or whether it was in some personal environment that you occupy. When was the last time you thought about empathy towards yourself or empathy traditionally towards others? Now, it's something that I find myself thinking about almost daily, and it's because I find it to be such a powerful and transformative characteristic and skill to embody. But this wasn't something that I always thought about. Now, when I was a teeny tiny Corey, I remember my first time taking the Myers-Briggs personality test. Now, if you're not familiar with this, it has these dimensions. You have extroverted or introverted, you have sensory or intuitive, you have thinking versus feeling, and finally you have judging or perceiving. And the research on Myers-Briggs suggested that people fit into one of 16 personality types. When I took this, mine was ESFJ, which usually gets categorized as someone who is supportive and encouraging and making sure that others are happy. Now, I loved every letter of this, but somehow I just could not get excited about the F, the feeling part. Some of it, I'm sure, looking back, Monday morning quarterbacking that experience was due to gendering, which is deep, that even as a kid, I perceived that by being a boy, with feelings that would somehow be an aberration in my class or certainly in my school. And that's its own deep and complex web that I untangle and I continue to challenge in my life. But another influence over that perception about feeling was the value that I feel like we often place on what it means to be a thinker, to be analytic, or to be logical. It felt like a liability, particularly to be so extreme in the F category. However, as I grew older, I began to shift. I started to notice that people valued what F brought to the table. Even if the system that we were in reinforced the importance of being a thinker. I knew that my geometry teacher, for instance, wasn't giving me A's because I understood how Pythagoras might have felt about right angles and triangles. But outside of the tests, outside of the problem sets, I saw how useful F was in solving problems for people. And by the time I got to college, I found myself seeing how F was helpful for mediating and resolving conflicts between residents. Shouts out to Towers 1 and 2. And by the time I was a year into working full time, I began to see how helpful being an F was at identifying ways people could develop and find career opportunities. And so over time, being in touch with my emotions actually and the emotions of others wasn't really the liability that I assumed it was. And being compelled to help others wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Empathy in most cases was a value add, and it helped me practice placing this person that I was into the world. And it also helped me practice placing the people around me in personal and professional spaces at the center of whatever impact I wanted to achieve, both personally and professionally. Now, empathy exists as one element of a broader conversation about emotional intelligence, which has its roots in psychology and therapy, as researchers have grappled with this notion that traditional measures of intelligence, like IQ, couldn't fully explain our cognitive ability as human beings. Now, when I talk about emotional intelligence, what I'm really talking about are a breakdown of 5 components. And these 5 components were popularized by Daniel Goleman in his 1995 book, Emotional Intelligence. So EI, emotional intelligence, or EQ, emotional quotient, is a measure of self-awareness, which is being comfortable with your own thoughts and emotions and understanding how they impact others. Self-regulation, controlling and managing your impulses. Internal motivation, having a passion for what you do rather than solely being motivated by external reward. And social skill, friendliness that builds healthy relationships for personal and organizational benefit. And of course, the 5th, as mentioned, is empathy. And as it's defined here, is understanding and reacting to the emotions of others. Now, as leaders, either leaders in formal positions of authority or with the ability to influence and move and shake in our organizations, why should empathy and more broadly emotional intelligence even matter to us? Why spend time thinking about it? Why show up to this seminar or webinar and talk about it? Well, first, it's important to employees. So in 2020, LinkedIn conducted a 14,000 person member survey, which focused on the future of leadership. And they found that 55% of respondents indicated a purpose-driven and caring mindset was the number one thing leaders should strive for. Now, digging into this, 51% of respondents said leaders need to know how to be motivated, engaging, and inspiring. Emotional intelligence and listening and communication skills were also at the top of the list for leaders to embody at 39% and 34% of respondents respectively. And get this, 51% of respondents in this survey don't think their leaders are currently practicing these skills well. It also matters because, as I mentioned earlier, IQ doesn't fully explain our cognitive ability. In fact, according to research published in 2004, cognitive ability is not just about being technically competent. Researchers surmise that IQ only contributes about 20% to one's success. And while IQ was linked to job performance and recruitment, EQ was linked with a leader's ability to retain their position and then be successful in their role. So I do a lot of work in the inclusion space, which I mentioned earlier, and I found this piece to be a common theme for people. At the core of the human experience is really this desire to actually just feel and be accepted in the spaces that we occupy. And so when we talk about empathy and showing up empathetically as leaders, what we're really talking about is increasing our capacity to understand and show up for employees. This compassion, not only that I feel what someone else feels, but that I am actually compelled to help that person out in some way, gives that experience or that employee an experience where they say, hey, I have a place to belong. And more important, my experiences belong here. That validation and that belonging is ultimately what leads to more productive employees. Better Up conducted research to investigate the role of belonging at work and the consequences of not having it. And what they found was that high belonging was linked to a 56% increase in job performance, a 50% drop in turnover risk, and a 75% reduction in sick days. They also were able to note that there was a 167% increase in employee willingness to recommend their company to others. So again, the deep connection between empathy, fostering belonging, and what it means to then have a productive and healthy workforce. As we think about empathy and the other components of emotional intelligence, self-awareness, as I mentioned, self-regulation, internal motivation, social skill, and empathy, how do you think you are showing up for each of these components? Now, one natural place to begin examining and probing is with our leadership styles. Now, I believe that our styles are a reflection of where we feel most comfortable, motivating, and inspiring others. And that judgment and my framing is based on our understanding of our fellow workers and colleagues and the relationship of their individual goals to the team's broader aims. We built that understanding of our colleagues using emotional intelligence as a tool. So, depending on your leadership style, it may indicate how important emotional intelligence actually is in that process for you. Now, as I'm talking, I want you to take a moment to think. Who is a leader from the past or who's alive today that inspires you? And how did they motivate others? For me, I've always been inspired by and wanted to emulate the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in every way. I remember even dressing up one year as him for career day at my local community center and reading the I Have a Dream speech. And when people came up to me and asked me, well, what do you want to be when you grow up? For a while, I didn't say pastor, which is what MLK did, or I didn't say organizer, which is what he may be known for, or teacher because of the wisdom that he imparted. I actually just said, I want to be MLK himself. And I think as I learned about him as a leader, I felt like he had a vision that others bought into, certainly enough to be arrested or put themselves in harm's way for the cause. He was an amazing orator, and he embodied humility. And he was described, and he is described, as a compassionate and an empathetic leader. At the time as a kid, I didn't know what to call this style, but I knew that all of these things were things that I wanted to emulate. Over time, people have created frameworks, specific styles and matrices to explain the different approaches to leadership. Now, I've found about 10 to be the most common, but there may certainly be others. For instance, you have the coaches who are really getting employees to ask the question, have you considered this? You have the visionary who can walk into a room and literally their entire energy says, follow me. You have the servant, which is where I feel like Dr. Martin Luther King sat, which is your needs come first. You have the democratic leader who's always in the room, making sure that people's opinions are heard. You have the transformational leader, where that person inspires people to innovate. You have the autocratic leader, where you say, hey, this is my way or the highway. You have laissez-faire, which is you don't need oversight. There's the pace setter leader who is do what I do, I'll lead by example. Transactional leadership, which is if I do this, you will do this in return. And finally, the bureaucratic leader, as in there's a process, there's an established way of doing things, so we do this by the book. Out of these 10, do you hear your inspiration? Can you place yourself within any of these? Like most things, leadership styles are tools. So depending on the situation, some styles may be more relevant and useful than others. However, there is one style that is often pointed to as the most effective in business settings. And that style is transformational leadership, or, as I mentioned earlier, walking into a room and inspiring people to innovate. Now, why is that? Well, research from the 2000s found that transformational leadership tends to empower and motivate employees and colleagues, especially motivating within them a commitment to quality and enhanced productivity. Also, transformational leadership builds trust. Now, when you're a transformational leader, you tend to spend less time on non-productive activities like drawing up a highly detailed procedure or looking at every simple or complex task and needing to be directly involved with it. And the transformational leader steps back in a way that allows employees and colleagues to continue to innovate and lean into their own creativity around some of those things. Transformational leaders also inspire norms that focus on empowerment, which in turn promotes the constructive and achievement-oriented behavior by their coworkers. Now, how does this relate to where we started with emotional intelligence and with empathy? Now, transformational leadership is correlated with those core components of emotional intelligence that we talked about earlier. Transformational leadership includes 4 dimensions, and hopefully when I talk about them, you'll start to hear some similarities between what I mentioned earlier with emotional intelligence and this framework for leadership. So the first component is individual influence. So you are a role model of values and ethical principles. The second is intellectual stimulation. You inspire creativity and autonomy, and you are constantly challenging assumption, and you're soliciting perspectives without actually being criticizing of those perspectives. The third is individualized consideration. And so what I mean by that is that you are in a position where you can recognize the unique motivations and the needs of other people. And the fourth is inspirational motivation. So you can give clear vision and you can inspire commitment to those goals. And you are an effective communicator. Now, individual influence is closely correlated with this emotional intelligence component of self-awareness. Do you know what you value and how that shows up in others? Inspirational motivation is closely correlated with the emotional intelligence component of internal motivation. And what I mean by that is asking the question, do you know how to articulate your goals and envision in a way that gets other people inspired to follow along with you? Individualized consideration is closely correlated with the emotional intelligence component of empathy. Do you actually take the time to understand the needs and the experiences of those around you in order to effectively advocate and support them? In practice, showing up as a transformational leader can look like encouraging the colleagues we work with or the teams that we lead to find their own unique way of doing things. It can mean fostering supportive relationships, communicating, validating each person's work and contributions to the team and the broader company. Maybe it's helping colleagues connect to a sense of passion and deeper motivation within the culture of the organization. Or maybe it's building trust through consistency of your own values and ideals. The ideals that you will exhibit and that you advocate for, not just within the team, but within the broader company. Now, a nerd moment. I used to be a mathlete in high school and middle school. So when I actually think about the relationship of transformational leadership and emotional intelligence, one thing I think about is how they are transitively linked by this element of empowering others. Meaning, if transformational leadership ultimately empowers others, and transformational leadership and emotional intelligence are correlated across multiple dimensions, then it must mean that emotional intelligence is ultimately about developing skills that empower us to empower others. So, how do we cultivate empathy as a skill in a way that will impact our workplaces? So the first thing that I want to call out is to go out on Google and quiz yourself. There's an article called "Do You Lead with Emotional Intelligence" by Annie McKee, and take the quiz. The reason why I like this quiz is because it's 25 questions, and it took me about 5 minutes to take when I did it. So hopefully it shouldn't feel like a final exam level of stress. But this test, which was published on HBR, Harvard Business Review, should leave great examples at the end of how to hone specifically each aspect of emotional intelligence, the 5 that we mentioned before. The second thing is, you'll see that I have a Hamilton reference here, is when I remember watching the show, the characters would often say, talk less, smile more. But I would posit that the point of this conversation is to say, talk less and listen more. And this is a reference to active listening. There is research that really actually started me on this journey of looking at empathy as a skill. and it was called Durably Reducing Transphobia, a field experiment on door-to-door canvassing. And this research was done by David Brookman and Joshua Kalla. Now, what they were essentially trying to do was measure empathy and the impact of empathy on other people. Specifically, this research examined deeply ingrained prejudices and the effect of having just one 10-minute conversation where actively taking the perspective of others is encouraged. This technique that they use is called deep canvassing, and it was done in South Florida and targeting anti-transgender prejudice substantially. And what they found was that it substantially reduced transphobia, and the effect persisted for 3 months. Now, what's different about this as opposed to regular canvassing? You might be familiar with canvassing from a political standpoint, where the goal is I have a set of facts, I have a set of opinions, maybe, and I'm going door to door, or I'm making phone calls, and I essentially say, hey, do you have a moment of time? I have 5 points about an issue that I really care deeply about or that I represent, and I need you to hear them. And then after those points are issued or talked about, you ask, are you going to vote for my position? The difference with deep canvassing is that it actually puts the canvasser in the position of a listener and someone who can actually pull out the narrative of the other person that they are listening to. And so the goal is not to go in with a set of facts, but to actually go into the conversation, really trying to understand what the deeper motivation is for that person. One of the interesting examples and one of the interesting things that came out of that study was a story about how one canvasser who did not present as transgender started the deep canvassing conversation with a participant. And ultimately what they found was that this person, through asking them their why, through really understanding their story, through asking questions about why they supported, at that time, anti-transgender legislation, what they found was that it wasn't actually about the issue of the transgender community and whether they should or shouldn't be able to transition, but was actually about this idea of safety. And this storyteller, this person that was being asked the question, ultimately said, for me, I just don't feel safe in certain spaces. And so it's very important for me to support things where I help people feel safe. And that was where the canvasser was able to find a connection point. It's like, hey, you see yourself as someone who is a champion of safety. Let me communicate to you how this conversation is actually one, not about do you support whether somebody has a right to transition, but whether you have a right as an individual to be safe. And it's stories like that that really demonstrated the power of being able to deep canvas and then ultimately exhibit some type of empathy that had a substantial change in the way in which a person saw an issue and maybe saw themselves in relation to an issue. Psychologists call this active processing. And the reason why psychologists find that so powerful is that they find that changes tend to stick with people when they are directly involved in the process of changing their own mind and coming up with the solution, as opposed to being told what the solution is. And that's the power of empathy, just showing up to listen and help people see whether the narrative that they have about themselves is congruent with this narrative and how it's actually showing up in the world. And if you're wondering, the study is called Durably Reducing Transphobia, so emphasis on durable. Is it lasting? I mentioned after that study, they were able to tell that it lasted for 3 months after the initial conversation in a statistically significant way. But they also did another study in 2020 to see if they could repeat the experiment and the results of the experiment. And you can look this one up if you're interested in reading the research. And it was called Reducing Exclusionary Attitudes Through Interpersonal Conversation. So they went even deeper into this idea of empathy in just the title. And it was the same researchers. And what they found was that the results of the first study could be replicated, and also found additional insights that the key elements to the durable change, so showing up with empathy and then hoping that it has some lasting effect, are being able to practice patience, being able to create space where someone can share their life story, and being able to exhibit the skills necessary for active listening. So I talk about the second point because it really ties back to both how we talk about emotional intelligence and empathy, but also how we talk about transformational leadership. The idea of being able to transform someone else, to be able to connect someone to their true values and help motivate them to see themselves in a different way. And then the idea of individual influence, being able to come in as a leader and really establish what your values are and motivate others in that space. Finally, the third thing that I would point out, one thing that you can do is to just seek new perspectives and stories. Now, every day I try to read a new article or a new piece of content about something that I'm not really familiar with. But you can do this a number of different ways. Maybe you can make the time to listen, for instance, to the stories of some of your colleagues. And I have an example of how my manager did this for me. I remember a few years ago being deeply affected by the death of Philando Castile and also the death of Alton Sterling. And these were two Black men that were killed by police officers, and both of which had been live streamed for all of us to witness for maybe the first time and this happened. So I remember after that, I mustered the energy to head to work. I tried to conduct myself with a business as usual attitude, leaving that sad, affected part of myself to be sorted out off the clock. And I thought this approach was so necessary to actually just cope with the day and to show up the way I was supposed to in the workplace. However, when I saw my manager later that day, I realized that what I was actually looking for, what I needed most, was empathy. Someone taking the time to see me and taking the time to actually just care about the moment. So I remember she asked me, "How are you doing?" Which the question we get dozens of times in a day. And because of that, I gave a very automatic response, the kind where you assume the question is a formality, so the answer should be as well. And she did the most amazingly simplistic thing. She made space for me. Not only did she take the moment to ask again and illustrate that she actually was making the time and wanted to process the answer, she actually said, "Hey, I want to create a space for you to talk about you for a second, not about the work, not about where you're headed, not about the meeting that you have today, but about how you are doing. What is your story right now in this moment?" And in that very moment, she created an opportunity for me to process and reflect through her own empathy. She made time for my actual story, not just the one that I showed up to work with, but the one that defined my reaction to that news of Philando Castile and Alton Sterling, and the parts of myself that sometimes I realized I hid in an effort to actually show up to work in a way where others would take me more seriously or respect me. I remember I had walked into that day feeling the burden of the news and the emotions and experiences that it triggered for me. But that conversation made me feel like it wasn't just my burden to bear and that it wasn't just my story to hold. And her act also made me rethink that idea that only parts of myself were welcome or necessary in the workplace. All of me, my experiences, my skills, my expertise, my life challenges, and my personal and professional interests could and should find a place in the space that I occupy almost every day. And it's so interesting because I honestly feel like even though this happened years ago, again, I mentioned the moment of hearing this news, I still feel the impact of that. And it really has shaped the way in which I show up into workspaces now. And that was a simple gesture that meant so much to me. And so when I think about my manager at the time and the transformational leadership that she embodied, I really see the individualized consideration coming through, having the mindfulness to notice the emotions that others may be experiencing and building connections between that rational and that emotional zone that we sometimes try to move back and forth between. We're all looking for empathetic leaders in the workplace. And empathy and emotional intelligence ultimately drives positive performance for everyone. So as we think about emotional intelligence, think about our default leadership style and whether that style that we use most regularly, most often, is the most effective way for building innovative, empathetic, and productive environments. And as I close, my charge to you is to transform your teams with the power of empathy by slowing down, by finding moments to be mindful, and to actively listen to and invite in the stories of others in your environment. I want to thank you so much for listening to this. I wanted to leave time for questions. I know there were a lot that were submitted, so I'm happy to take those as well as others in the chat.
Awesome. Thanks, Corey. That was wonderful. And yes, we did have quite a few questions submitted beforehand, so we can start with those. And then if anyone else has questions you'd like to add, just put them in the chat and we will get to as many of them as we can. All right, the first one. Do you find that women are perceived differently from men when they model empathy in the workplace?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, unfortunately, because of intersectionality and also just identity, there are a lot of things that we see developing in like a workspace where people have a double standard. And so certainly when we think about what it means to be empathetic as a male versus empathetic as a woman, sometimes how that might play out is in the form of bias, where one person might be seen as, wow, that's very cutting edge or very thoughtful. And for another person is, wow, she lacks confidence or she's not a go-getter. It actually reminds me, that question reminds me of a broader conversation around what does it mean to have executive presence, which I think executive presence it considers three things: appearance, communication, and gravitas. And that gravitas piece is the one that's so interesting, because I think this is where it comes up, because the expectation is that to have gravitas, you have to be, hard, and you have to have charisma, and you have to be a go-getter. But often what research actually finds is that being most true to you and being most authentic is ultimately what makes gravitas stick, like what makes people respect you, what makes people want to follow you. And that authenticity is built actually with empathy, like understanding what others need and how you show up. And so I do think that as we're to think about that question is like, I think it's important to not only like practice empathy, but also make space for a more holistic definition of empathy. So on both sides of the coin, as a leader, it's like, how are we examining how people exhibit that and giving it more power or giving it more standing in our organizations?
Awesome. Next question. How do we show empathy and ensure productivity at work at the same time?
Another good question. So It's no secret that I think you can get things done quickly or you can get things done right. And I think that's kind of what I'm talking about with empathy. There's some research, I'm forgetting the actual author, but essentially that talks about how having groups that are empathetic or really taking the time to tease out different perspectives may not necessarily get things done as quickly, but they actually consider all of the things, including things outside of the box. And so what I would say is that it really depends on what problem you're trying to solve. For things that might be simple, for things that might be routinized, there might be a need to actually say, like, here's the way to do things. We don't necessarily need to hear all of the different perspectives on how to do it, because there's a very clear way to do it, or at least a process that's been established. But for especially for complex problems or things that are going to affect a lot of people, I think that it's not necessarily productive, isn't necessarily fast. And those two things shouldn't necessarily be synonymized in that case.
With workplace shortages, with the workplaces continually facing labor shortages, what strategies would you offer on slowing down and making space as the demands are continually increasing?
Yeah, so another great question. I really do think that the part of the reason why I appreciate or like empathy is for what I talked about earlier about the actual productivity increases that we see just by being empathetic with the employees that are currently there, right? So, I mean, even while labor shortages are a reality, it's almost like the chicken or the egg conversation. It's like labor shortages are real. So do we like spend the capital or the investing time and energy into trying to get more people in, while not necessarily focusing on those things that foster an empathetic and inclusive culture? Because then the problem is that there might be burnout. There might be people that are high turnover risk, or there might be people that take a long time to onboard, so they are not productive and as like short of a time window as you might need. Whereas there might be a lot of people at the organization who are, yes, you are short staffed, they might be handling a lot, but maybe that culture of empathy helps people stay motivated, helps people stay around longer, even if the going is rough or is hard. So I mean, I think it's certainly a balance. Like, you're going to obviously need more people, but it might actually like reduce the acuteness of feeling that labor shortage by investing in empathy on the front end and increasing productivity with the people that are there.
So, great. My former company had a D&I initiative, but it was almost like an echo chamber because the only active members we had were minorities. How can we use empathy to foster greater participation and conversation across all team members?
Yeah, another great question. Empathy at the core of it is really about how do we connect to that common story in all of us. And so I think a lot about this idea of like, even if like say a DEI council or committee stands up around the premise of, hey, there are particular issues that these communities are facing that we want the company to address, rather than hearing that piece of it and trying to understand, well, what is it like being a Black man in this company? What is it like being a woman in this company? I need to understand that in order to support. Try to think about, what does it mean to feel excluded? What does it mean to not feel heard? What does it mean to feel like your voice is not valued in a room? Those questions, if we all dig deep, are probably questions that all of us, no matter what our identity or background, can answer. Even if it goes back to middle school and not getting picked for the kickball team, at some point we've had an experience where we can say, this is what I would have wanted if I wanted someone to actually show up for my voice in a space. And so I think that one is asking that question and really trying to relate to that when you see initiatives like this stood up at companies. And then I think the second piece is, again, taking active interest in learning about other people's stories. So even in a virtual environment, how much time do you set aside to actually just have conversations one-on-one with your colleagues, a 30-minute coffee chat or virtual coffee chat? How often do you like anchor the beginning of meetings, even if it's just 2 minutes, for like somebody to do a share out of something that they like cared about or that they worked on over the weekend? Like, I think these things help us see one another more as human beings in the workplace, so that when an initiative like that comes along, we're not trying to say, do I support that issue, but saying, hey, do I support that person? Do I support that person's experiences as they're relaying them?
That's great. How does an empathetic leader not appear weak?
Yeah, that again, part of it is just how do we reframe empathy? The reason that I like how much transformational leadership intersects with empathy is because that leadership styles is something I feel like companies talk a lot about. Like we'll go send people off for training to be trained as a transformational leader or someone that can turn around a team to get them to innovate and think creatively and problem solve, but not give empathy the credit that it's due and actually saying like, and it takes a strong leader to be empathetic in that way, right? To be able to be in a position where you're understanding somebody's perspective and like not letting it like shake your confidence in yourself or your ability to still execute. So I mean, I think part of it is really just with the reframe of empathy as a skill and how we can actually start to talk about it that way instead of as a, it's a nice to have, but it's not going to help us get things done. I think the second thing is kind of in modeling the ways in which it's productive. Like maybe it's just like on one project, like really thinking about what it means to actively listen or to bring in different perspectives, with some of the tools or techniques I talked about earlier and seeing whether the work product changes. And so I think that if you are a leader of a team where you're doing that almost in an incubator test case, then you have data points where you can point to and say, well, my team has the lowest turnover rate, has the healthiest like relationships, has the best work product. How can I be a weak leader if all of these things in these projects that I'm doing show otherwise?
Great. So when checking in with teams, how do you think about a balance of individualized question and listening in one-on-one conversations and quick surveys for everyone to say how they're doing and what they need? Could you suggest some tools for survey questions related to workplace belonging and burnout?
Yeah. So I mean, I think at scale, obviously surveys are a great tool. And so I think I would say that it really depends on the level of trust that you built with your team and with the company. So I think if you're working to build that type of relationship or that type of culture within the team, I think absolutely starting with the survey makes a lot of sense to get directional signal on here are things that matter to the broadest set of people, but that shouldn't then stop you from doing additional investigation on like the tactics to serve those things, right? So if you find that people are really focused on burnout culture across a survey, then have one-on-one conversations about, hey, survey data suggested this. How does burnout culture affect you in your particular life? And so I think that there's still value in having a one-on-one conversation, even if you get directional signal that there's a broad theme that matters to most people. If you have built the trust with the team, then I think that this is where not doing things on behalf of, but doing things in support of the different people that are a part of your community or part of your team, as you've learned, become to understand their issues proactively, I think is how you optimize for like getting things done, even in the midst of like needing additional data like one-on-one conversations or survey data.
We have so many great questions. The next one is, does empathy imply agreement?
No, and I think that is the thing that I wanted to highlight really from the earlier research is that it wasn't necessarily that the person was agreeing with the position, though it ultimately did turn out that way. What they were agreeing with is that they valued the same thing. So both people valued safety. And so, I would say empathy and agreement aren't the same. It's really just going to a place where you can understand why someone would think the way that they think, which sometimes can be hard, especially when we have deeply held beliefs about something, even yes, if it's bolstered by actual facts. I do this work a lot in workshops where we do something called belief mapping, which is, can you name different facts or different things about something you deeply hold to be true? And like people can do that. But then when it's like, can you think about why someone would believe the exact opposite and do the same thing? It becomes a lot harder. And so the goal is not necessarily to say your facts are better, their facts are better, but just to say that depending on the circumstances and life experiences, someone could have a completely different set of facts and come to the same issue with a completely different perspective. And that's it. You can still disagree. I won't go into it now, but I have another story where I did have a conversation like in practice with somebody who had a different political opinion than me about affirmative action. And I think that it was a test case for this specific thing about how to have a difficult conversation and how to root it in understanding what they actually value as opposed to what they say.
What tactics do you see that are impactful during remote work?
Yeah, remote work is hard, but I think to the extent one, technology has really allowed us to do a lot of things that maybe we didn't think we would be able to do even a year ago, just with like the boom of video calling platforms and all these online games tools and like online rooms. So I would say like, what can you do to kind of recreate like in-person experiences? Certainly if there's like video fatigue, there are like awesome ways to like even just like ship empathy or love through like the things that show that we're thinking of people, that we've like keyed in on something that somebody's really into or that somebody had done over the weekend, and just sending an email to like thank them for it. Like I think there are a lot of different ways to actually do simple things to remind people that like, hey, we see you and there's a connection beyond the video screen and a remote environment. Some other tactical things I think are, figuring out like, are there things that you can do as a community, but virtually? I was actually a part of a virtual spaghetti party recently where some coworkers decided to just literally organize around a random theme and then just turn the cameras on and like cook and have like a virtual evening dinner, right? So I think that there are a lot of ways you can be creative, but really it's about just identifying touch points that say, hey, I know something about what you're into and I want to share that. I acknowledge that, and that it's cool that you shared it.
Awesome. All right. And how do you encourage empathy towards people who are oppressive?
That's hard. That goes back to a little bit of what I was saying with the belief mapping. I think it really is just about preparing for those encounters. Of course, if you're in a position where you feel unsafe or you feel like it's not congruent with like where you are in that moment, like never put yourself in a position where you're trying to like bend over backwards essentially for someone who's only going to meet you with a hard wall, or in the worst case like actually threaten you. But I do feel like in the same way that we prepare for presentations with big execs, or we like try to close a deal that's going to have huge implications for the company, the things that we do are we prepare for uncertainties. We try to be flexible and adapt to not having all the information. We try to read the person or the room before we get in there and understand what types of things we're going to encounter so that we can prepare as much as possible for that. Because I would argue that that's really the same tactics, if you're really trying to show up with empathy, that it would take to encounter somebody who is maybe generally biased or generally showing up with some wall that makes them oppressive or makes them difficult to engage with. It's like, can you do the prep to think about all the ways in which they might believe something or see something, to prepare yourself to interact with that person?
All right, so we think we have time for one last question. This one's pretty good. So it says, I see a keyboard. Is there a motivational, impactful to you? And will you share a few bars with us, please?
That is a great question. So yes, this is a keyboard, but it actually is a production keyboard. So unfortunately, it only plugs directly into like a production software. So I would have to actually like, I wouldn't play because it would be coming through the computer. But I will say that yes, one of the things that I do in my spare time is working on music, because it is a release for me. It is cathartic. It's a way that I process the things that are happening around me. And so I do have a lot of music actually on my website. So if you go to coreyponder.com, you will actually see a lot of the things that I have created in those spaces where I need to process or where I need to stay motivated and like re-energize myself.
Well, that was wonderful. This has been absolutely fantastic, Corey. I hope that everyone leaves as encouraged and as I am after this, and we can take some of these and put this into practice. And so, Corey, thank you so much for sharing all this advice with us. And to all of you who attended today, I would like to encourage all of you to check out our career resources and events provided by the Vanderbilt Alumni Association, which you can find at vuconnect.com/career. We will also be sending out a follow-up email with information about our upcoming events. There should be a survey popped into your chat. So please, if you have time, we would love for you to fill that out for us and give your thoughts on this so we can continue to provide resources like this for you all. And have a wonderful, wonderful afternoon. Thank you again.
Thank you.